Well, hello there, internet stranger. You've happened to stumble upon the second video in a series of videos in which I will be ranking the MCU movies from least best to best. If you haven't watched the first video, where I talk about movies number 23 through 21 on my list, make sure to do so before watching this video. I'll do my best to put a link in the description. I'm trying to figure it out still. This is literally only the second video I've ever recorded for YouTube, so I'm still trying to figure some things out. Once again, I did want to put out a light spoiler warning for this video because I will be discussing some key plot points of the movies, and it's I can't talk about them without spoiling a few things. And so, with that out of the way, here are films number 20 through 16 on my list from my MCU movies ranking list. So, my 20th favorite MCU movie is Thor. I appreciate the director, Kenneth Branagh, for trying to bring a different vibe to this movie. The tone was a bit different to the MCU movies that had been released at the time, and it still does stand out today compared to the rest of the MCU, which for me is a little bit of a drawback from the film. Also, bleached eyebrows. If you know, you know. This movie isn't so much about superheroes, but rather about the struggles of a family ruling over a kingdom that all just happen to have superpowers. And this is pretty consistent with the rest of the MCU, where they talk about just kind of people that happen to have superpowers. So we'll chalk that up as a positive for this film. The fish out of water experience of the character of Thor in this movie does lend itself to a few great comedic moments, some of which my friends and I still quote to this day. A scene that takes place in a diner in particular comes to mind. Thor's theme music is also one of the best in the entirety of the MCU. Now, that kind of concludes my thoughts on Thor, and some of you might be wondering how I have Thor ranked below Thor the Dark World. Well, you don't have to wait long because number 19 on my list is Thor the Dark World. The main antagonist in this film, Malekith, the Dark Elf, is probably the worst in the entire MCU. He's pretty useless, forgettable, and barely puts up a fight during the film's climax. But that's pretty much the only issue I have with this film. I think the film does improve upon the first Thor in a couple different ways. First of all, no bleached eyebrows. Also, the cinematography in this movie is pretty beautiful, even if the colors on the screen don't pop. It's not very colorful, but it still looks nice. This film also treats us to our first real Thor and Loki team up, which shows character depth and a little bit of growth for both of them. There are also several aspects of this film that become important in later MCU movies. So there's some things that happen in this movie that are critical for the future, and I think once you watch the future movies, that allows you to appreciate this movie a little bit more upon subsequent viewings. Now, Thor the Dark World is considered by many to be one of the weaker MCU films, and I agree because it doesn't reach the heights that the best MCU movies do, but I do like it, I think, a little bit more than most people do. Moving on, number 18 on my list is Iron Man 2, and this film suffers from the too many villains problem. When you have more than one bad guy in a movie, usually there is one that's like the real threat, and one that the audience just doesn't care about. In this movie, in Iron Man 2, the one that we don't care about is Justin Hammer. The other guy, Ivan Vanko, or Vanko, I always forgot how to pronounce his name, he's set up to be like a formidable opponent, so we think he's the one who's like, we fear him the most. But in the end, he actually kind of goes on pretty easily. There isn't much of a fight put up by him in the kind of climactic battle scene. Some positives, of this movie for me include Nick Fury showing up. We got the introduction of Black Widow and Rhodey becoming War Machine, and we also get the setup for the first Avengers movie. I don't really have like too strong opinions either way about this movie, and so the lack of a strong opinion kind of I consider a weakness, so I put it near the bottom of my list. Sticking with Iron Man, number 17 on my list is Iron Man 3. Like Iron Man 2, again, I don't really have any strong opinions either way. The Mandarin reveal on this movie was met with pretty polar opposite response. People either loved it or hated it. Again, I didn't hate it, but I wasn't offended by it either. I thought Ben Kingsley acted the heck out of it. That was a tricky role, so I'll give that kind of a pass. I do applaud the film for giving us a look into Tony Stark's life post the events of the Avengers movie, and it's great to see how the events of one movie impact the events of others. It helps to cement the idea that even all of these separate franchises within the MCU are still part of one larger narrative. But as was the case with Iron Man 2, Movies I don't have strong opinions about tended to find themselves near the bottom of my rankings, which is how Iron Man 3 ends up in the 17th spot. And film number 16 on my list, the last film for this video, is Captain Marvel. Now, I have two main issues with this movie. The first is that Captain Marvel's powers are never really defined. There are some points in the movie where she, can't do much with her powers. She, doesn't have master over them. Yet in others, she's one of the most OP characters in the whole MCU. And that inconsistency is a bit frustrating for me, as it was for a lot of other people who had issues with this movie. And speaking of inconsistencies, I feel like Carol Danvers was kind of written by two completely different people, which she was. And it is kind of hard to explain if you haven't seen the movie, but her reactions, to certain things and the way she carries herself throughout the film is just kind of inconsistent. I can't think of a different word to use. Now, don't get me wrong. I think Brie Larson does a fine job acting in this movie. I think she was a good choice to play Captain Marvel. But again, there's just some inconsistencies in the reactions that I kind of have an issue with. Some positives from this movie include a pretty sweet nostalgic 90s soundtrack, and there's also some good chemistry between Brie Larson and Samuel L. Jackson, who's playing a young Nick Fury in this movie. So there you have it, numbers 20 through 16 on my MCU movie ranking list. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, if anyone's watching this. Make sure you check back in with the channel as I continue ranking all the MCU movies from least best to best. Thanks for watching, and have a great day.